Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we're diving into one of the most absolutely stunning shifts in modern corporate history today. I want you to just picture the reality of the tech landscape in the year 2025. It's a reality that, honestly, if you told someone just a decade or two ago, they would have said you were completely out of your mind. Here's the deal. The company that practically built the modern computer ended up needing a massive government bailout literally just to survive. Meanwhile, a completely different company, one that used to be known mostly for making niche chips for video gamers, became one of the most valuable companies on planet Earth. So how in the world did this actually happen? Right now, on one side, we've got Nvidia, sitting comfortably at the absolute peak of global market value. And on the other, we have Intel, an absolute titan of industry that was forced to accept a multi-billion-dollar lifeline just to keep the lights on. But you know what's truly fascinating about this? 15 years before this wild 2025 reality, both of these companies were actually racing to build the exact same kind of technology. Intel had all the money in the world, they had all the factories, and they had a massive head start. But as we're going to see today, Intel quit. Nvidia didn't. This is the story of how the undisputed king of computing lost the most important chip war of the century by simply walking away from it. Let's start with Section 1, two different tech giants. If we travel back in a time machine to the late 20th century, Intel didn't just have rivals, it had an entire industry built underneath it. Intel was the absolute master of the CPU, or the central processing unit. You can think of the CPU as the flexible brain of computing. It's the chip that handles basically everything, from balancing your spreadsheets to running the web browser you might literally be using right now. Back then, nearly every personal computer on planet Earth ran on an Intel processor. Their co-founder, Gordon Moore, even gave his name to Moore's Law, the famous principle predicting the rapid growth of computing power. Back then, Intel wasn't just chasing the future, they basically were the future. Meanwhile, over in a completely different lane, you have Nvidia. Founded in 1993, they built the GPU, or Graphics Processing Unit. Now, unlike the super flexible CPU, the GPU was built to do one highly specific job incredibly well, pushing thousands of tiny math calculations all at exactly the same time, mostly to render fast-moving images on a screen. For years, almost everyone in the tech industry totally dismissed GPUs as just niche toys for video gamers. I mean, nobody in the mid-2000s believed the hardware rendering their digital race cars would end up running the world's most important technology. Well, nobody except Nvidia's CEO, Jensen Huang. Moving right along to Section 2, the parallel processing race. This brings us to a huge inflection point. Both of these companies independently realized the massive potential of parallel processing. Basically, that's the ability to do a ton of computations all at once. So around 2006, Intel started a highly secretive project called Larrabee. The idea was incredibly bold. They wanted to build a chip that behaved like a GPU, but they wanted to build it on Intel's own familiar x86 architecture. If they pulled it off, they'd dominate the CPU market and this brand new parallel computing frontier, a total monopoly. But Nvidia took a very different bet. Instead of trying to make their GPU act like a general-purpose chip, Jensen Huang stubbornly doubled down on pure, specialized parallel computing. Also in 2006, Nvidia released CUDA. This was a software platform that allowed programmers to use GPUs for complex, non-graphics tasks, things like intense scientific computing. So let's look at how this played out. In 2006, CUDA launches as this kind of modest side bet by Nvidia. Around that exact same time, Intel's Project Larrabee really gets underway. But as the months and years ticked by, Intel's Larrabee really struggled. Its graphics performance was super disappointing, and it just faced delay after delay. Finally, in 2009 and 2010, Intel made a fateful call. They completely canceled Larrabee as a consumer graphics chip. Now sure, parts of the project lived on as a specialized chip line called Xeon Phi, but Intel's grand vision for massive parallel computing just quietly faded away. Nvidia, on the other hand, they just stubbornly kept pouring resources into CUDA, patiently building out their software ecosystem year after year. Which brings us to Section 3, the AI revolution arrives. For the next decade, honestly, Intel's decision to cancel Larrabee seemed totally fine. They were still practically printing money with their CPUs. But underneath the surface, a massive shift was brewing. Fast forward to about 2012. Early artificial intelligence researchers made a groundbreaking discovery. It turned out that the exact kind of massive, repetitive parallel math that GPUs were originally built to do for video games was exactly what was needed to train complex neural networks for AI. It was a perfect match. And because of CUDA, Nvidia already had years of software tools built specifically for this kind of heavy lifting. They practically had a 10-year head start in both hardware and software. So by the time generative AI like ChatGPT exploded onto the mainstream scene in 2022 and 2023, the whole thing was entirely built and running on Nvidia hardware. Intel was suddenly left scrambling to catch up to a race it had actually started, sampled, and then just walked away from years earlier. Now, Intel didn't totally ignore the threat, of course. In 2019, they acquired an Israeli AI chip startup called Hibana Labs to produce Gaudi chips. And these were aimed right at competing with Nvidia in AI data centers. But it was kind of a case of too little, too late. The transition was really rocky. By 2024, Intel actually had to scrap its own forecast of selling over $500 million worth of Gaudi chips that year. They cited software issues and a really clumsy transition between chip generations. Nvidia's software moat, which they had been building over nearly 2 decades, was just way too deep for Intel to cross.
All right, Section 4, the innovator's dilemma.
You really have to ask yourself, how does a company with the vast resources and brilliant minds of Intel make such a catastrophic long-term strategic error? Well, the root cause can basically be summed up by former Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger. Years later, and ironically while speaking on stage at Nvidia's own conference of all places, Gelsinger admitted that Intel fell victim to the innovator's dilemma. First, they completely missed the smartphone revolution in the 2000s, and then they missed the AI chip revolution in the 2010s. He straight up confessed that had Intel just stayed the course with Larrabee, the future could have been remarkably different. He noted that at the absolute height of Intel's dominance, they dismissively viewed Nvidia's GPUs as just mere toys for video games. They were essentially blinded by their own success. Gelsinger publicly argued that Intel's decline really traced back to a fundamental shift in company culture. Basically, technologists stopped running the show and finance executives took over. Instead of aggressively reinvesting in next-generation manufacturing and chip design, Intel returned roughly $100 billion to its shareholders through buybacks and dividends. $100 billion! Now, while reasonable people can debate if this is the entire explanation, the facts are pretty clear. During this exact period, Intel's precious manufacturing lead eroded dramatically. It allowed rivals like TSMC to completely overtake them, eventually producing several times more chip wafers than Intel could. And the financial consequences of all these decisions? Well, they eventually arrived all at once. Between 2021 and the end of 2024, Intel's stock plummeted roughly 61%. It was brutal. And over that exact same period, Nvidia stock experienced a historic, astronomical surge of over 820%. This takes us to Section 5, the unthinkable role reversal. This brings us to the dramatic climax in 2024 and 2025. The leadership at Intel entered a period of severe chaos. In December of 2024, Pat Gelsinger actually stepped down under heavy pressure from Intel's board. Then, by March 2025, Lip Bhutan, a veteran venture capitalist, was brought in as the new CEO to somehow orchestrate a miracle turnaround. The environment was incredibly volatile. By August 2025, Intel faced intense political scrutiny when President Trump publicly called for Tan's resignation over his past business ties to China. However, just days later, after a White House meeting, Trump reversed course entirely, publicly calling Tan's success and rise an amazing story. But even with this rapid shift in political messaging, the financial reality for the company remained extremely dire. And that builds into an almost unthinkable conclusion. In August 2025, a massive bailout package is assembled. The U.S. government steps in with an $8.9 billion direct investment, taking a 9.9% ownership stake in the company. Japan's SoftBank adds another $2 billion in capital. But look closely at that middle detail. Nvidia, Intel's fiercest rival for over a decade, actually agrees to inject $5 billion into Intel and jointly develop new chips. I mean, wow. The company that literally defined American free market tech dominance now depended on a massive cash infusion from the very company that had just beaten them in the most important technological race of the century. The market reacted violently to this news, as you might expect. When the Nvidia investment was announced, Intel's stock jumped 22 to 23% in a single day. That was its biggest one-day gain since all the way back in 1987. This massive jolt helped recover Intel's total market value to roughly $170 billion, up from a terrifying low of near $83 billion earlier that year. It was a lifeline, for sure. It was real progress. But it was still a far, far cry from the undisputed dominance they once held over the entire industry.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, there is a really vital question we need to reflect on. What actually happens when a market leader mistakes its current dominance for permanent safety? Think about it. Nvidia didn't win the AI chip war with a lucky guess in 2023. They won by committing to a specialized, highly specific bet for nearly 20 years before that bet really paid off. They built software tools years before there was an obvious mainstream market for them. Intel had the resources, they had the talent, and they had the head start to make a similar bet. They even started to make one, but they walked away from it because the technology was still years from being immediately useful. By the time the need became absolutely obvious to the rest of the world, their advantage was completely gone. And this brings us to our final takeaway today. The hardest kind of business mistake isn't building the wrong product. It's correctly building the right one and then quitting before the world actually catches up to why it mattered. Intel saw the future, they literally held it in their hands, and they put it down. It really makes you wonder, which tech giants today are quietly dropping the very innovations that will define our world tomorrow? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the future is being built today.